some.
Oh yeah, it's fine. All right, here we go. Give me a second to full screen this. All right.
They don't want you to know the truth.
Hey, peace, everybody on Instagram. Go to YouTube if you want to ask any questions. Because as usual, I'm getting dropped. I'm out of the algorithm. Okay, here we go. Hey, peace, everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight for another episode of Disrupt the Chaos. Um, it's just every day is a nightmare, as everybody. And now the food and that they disappeared him, the brother from. I mean, that people are saying he was kidnapped because that's exactly what happened. It's like one of those movies where you watch and they like bang at the door, they have a van and they snatch someone off the street. I mean, it is so egregious because also that means they put him on a plane to Jena, Louisiana, where he's here now, and things are getting worse and worse. And I'm so glad we have Dr. Orisanmi. Is that did I say it right? Orisanmi. Yes, Dr. Orisanmi Burton, where we're going to talk about this incredible book called Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolts. But before we get into this, and we're also going to cover what's really happening up here in upstate New York. So Kathy Hochul today fired 2,000 correctional officers. And part of me is like, absolutely, go get a different type of job. But then that begs the question, who's in these facilities right now? And I'm thinking most likely all the prisons have locked down everybody, i.e. put them in the cell, probably giving them water and food, and that might be the only interaction, but that's a lot of COs, and it really speaks to the fact that in upstate New York, prison is still a business, and all these smaller towns that would manufacturing went away. A lot of these towns depend on farms and prisons. I mean, you see families in this town that have been in CO for decades. It's generational. And that just also speaks to what I believe will be more and more racial violence against our people, incarcerated or not. But we can never forget those behind the walls because they're going to suffer the most. So, just a couple things before we get into it. Today, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is closing all environmental justice offices. And what that means is the groups that we know that are doing incredible work around climate justice, like the Sunrise Movement, even the Hip Hop Caucus, Uprose, where our amazing sister Elizabeth Yempierre has created an incredible organization and space. So they're like, shut that down. And then Republican lawmakers are now beginning to target faculty tenure rights in 7 states. Arkansas, Kansas, Kentucky, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, and Texas are seeking to crack down on tenure rights by eliminating or implementing strict post-tenure review. As someone who's finishing her PhD, and as well as Dr. Burton already has finished it, I'm not sure if he's up for tenure yet or has it. We'll talk about that real quick. But look, this is what's happening now for me, at least in higher ed. I'm literally applying everywhere. And now some of these universities are saying they're putting a hiring freeze. And as we were talking last a couple days ago, fam, on Instagram especially, I'm like, listen, if they're coming out to Harvard, Harvard's going to be all right. Columbia's going to be all right. They got $1 billion endowments. And I have no love for Columbia because it has gentrified Washington Heights, and it's just a nightmare when you go there and see what they've done. But if that's happening to the big schools, like big name schools, people have to imagine then what happens to the smaller liberal arts college? What happens at Amherst? What happens at Hampshire? What happens at Rollins College? Like the attacks, and I think what's going to also happen, some of these colleges and universities are going to have to come together, or some of these colleges and universities are going to disappear very, very quickly. So that's that. These words are now discouraged at federal agencies. I'm going to go fast. Agencies have issued guidance to employees on hundreds of terms. An analysis of government websites shows all these words have been purged and removed from governmental pages. Activism, affirming care, anti-racism, assigned at birth, at risk, bias, BIPOC, biologically male, Black and Latinx, clean energy, climate crisis, confirmation bias, cultural heritage, DEI, disability, discriminatory, disparity, diverse groups, diversity, equity, feminism, Gulf of Mexico, hate speech, bias, intersectionality, LGBTQ, marginalized, at risk, multicultural, non-binary people, uterus, pregnant people, abortion, prejudice, pronouns, racial inequality, sexuality, social justice, socioeconomic, stereotypes, systemic, they, them, transgender, traumatic, unconscious bias, underprivileged victim. People, this is beyond 1984, any apocalyptic scenario we're in. And yesterday, yesterday, full list just came out today. Yesterday, over 60 colleges and universities around the country got notice from the State Department of Education that they're viewing these 60 colleges and universities as completely anti-Semitic and targeting Jewish people. And if they don't change anything different, that's what they're also going to pull funds from, shut them down, and other type of attacks. Also, Trump has said today that anybody who's a protester on a college campus can now be picked up and deported. Like where are we going? Like, I'm confused. Do I go back to the Bronx or Puerto Rico? Like, come on, dude. But these are the schools, and two of them are mine, alma maters. American University, Arizona State, Boston University, Brown University, California State University, Chapman, Columbia, Cornell. I'm an alum of Cornell. So I'm kind of, yes, of course, we're on the list. Drexel University, Eastern Washington, Emerson College, George Mason, Harvard, Illinois at Wesleyan, Indiana University, Johns Hopkins, Lafayette, Lehigh, Middlebury, Northwestern, Ohio State, Pomona College, Portland State University, Rutgers University, Newark, Santa Monica College, Sarah Lawrence College, Stanford, SUNY University, another graduate at my bachelor's, Albany, Binghamton, Rockland, Purchase, Swarthmore, Temple, the New School, Tufts, Tulane, Union College. I live near that. That's in Schenectady, New York. All the U California system, all the way to Hawaii and Manoa, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. All three of my alma maters are on this list, so I'm very proud of that. University of Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, South Florida, Southern California, U of Tampa, U of Tennessee, U of Virginia, University of Washington, Seattle, University of Wisconsin, Madison, Wellesley College, Whitman, and Yale. Well, let's just get into it, Dr. Burton. You're on the campus, you're at American University, you're saying that students are fired up. But I mean, people keep saying this is a McCarthy era moment, like the Red Scare, and I'm like, it's deeper than that. And lastly, fam, I think we just need to stop saying DEI, because it's not about DEI, it's about Black and brown bodies, right? So throw that out of your head. They're going to keep using that. The real issue is they're coming after us at any capacity, all our intersectionalities, our bodies, our mind, and everything, and people have a right to have fear. And believe me, fam, if you're feeling anxiety, I feel it every moment too. So Dr. Burton, that you're at American University in the heart of Washington, D.C., what can you tell us about your students and what's happening, at least within the faculty of American University?
Word. Yeah. Thanks for all that. First off, AU's not in the heart of DC. AU's in like the I don't know, some non-vital part of the body. What's it? The appendix. It's in the appendix of DC. So, the heart of DC is where the people are. AU is in an extremely wealthy part of the city that I had never been to until I started working there. One of the arguments that I make in Tip of the Spear is arguments that Black revolutionaries have been making for a long time, which is that that prisons are a paradigm for understanding what's happening beyond the walls. And so a lot of the stuff that we're feeling in really intensified ways are things that are sort of par for the course in prisons. And it's things that people who are in prison deal with all the time. And so I was thinking about this as you were talking about all the words that are being banned. And, one of the things that I talk about in the book and the article I wrote about the New York prison guard strike is narrative warfare, and how the narrative is actually an actual site of strategic intervention, where the state is always trying to manipulate language in order to control us more effectively, and where we have to also be thinking strategically. And one of the examples I use in the book is this moment in history around 1970, just as people inside prisons and outside are rebelling, that prisons all over the country are rebranded as correctional institutions. Guards are rebranded as correctional officers. Wardens are rebranded superintendents, right? Nothing else changed about the material conditions of the prison. It was just a renaming of these institutions so that we would then be encouraged to use words to refer to them that sort of advance the state's definition and understanding of these terms, right? So the fact that all these words are being banned on the outside is an example of the sort of Black radical analysis of prisons in the 70s being correct, insofar as they were arguing, look, y'all need to fight fascism here and now at one of its key points of sort of origin, right, which is the prison. If you don't fight it now, it's going to metastasize and spread throughout the society. So I think that's what we're seeing happening. And so, but also what that means is that a lot of the sort of lessons, the political lessons that many of these, revolutionaries and thinkers and philosophers behind the walls have been, many of the theories that they've been developing actually are an archive for us now to tap into as we start to think about what kinds of strategies we can use to resist this.
And forgive me, I just went to mode and read a little bit about your bio. So Dr. Burton is an assistant professor of anthropology at American University. He employs ethnographic and archival methods to examine historical collisions between Black organizations and state repression. And his work has been published in North American Dialogue, The Black Scholar, History Review, American Anthropologist, and many other outlets, and has received support.
That's good.
I'm always I know. I'm always for the Weiner Ground Foundation, and like I said, this is the new book, Tip of the Spear. So I never thought about that in terms of the language and the branding. Like the language changes, but the conditions stay the same, right?
Yeah, and they call it. I'm sorry to cut you off. They call it nomenclatural reform. Like there's a word for it, right? Nomenclatural reform, right? So it's just about taking certain terms out of circulation and putting new terms into circulation, right? So if you call it a correctional institution, that like encourages you to believe that it's supposed to actually correct people, even if you think it doesn't do that. By saying correctional institution, it encourages you to invest some of your energy into believing that that's what it's supposed to do, and that if we work harder at making it live up to its goal, that it would do that. As opposed to if you just call it a prison, or something else that they call it in the 60s was a concentration camp. It's like, you can't reform a concentration camp. It just has to be destroyed. So the very terms we use orients us politically in the world. And the state's very good at sort of trying to shape that.
You got your BA from Hampshire College, and Hampshire College is it's Amherst, New York, and I mean there is Amherst, New York, but Amherst, Massachusetts, and that's where I was for 3 years at UMass Amherst. Did you know when you went to college that this is the work you were going to do, or was there like a personal experience that you had, or Hampshire, which is a great it's a great college, it's dope, and how it treats its students in really good ways. Was it that you got to Hampshire and you're like, wait a minute, or were you coming from kind of conditions, or had a personal someone personal in your life, or just seeing what was happening around you and your friends, particularly as Black men?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting. I come from a political family, so a lot of this is really tied into my family history, but I hadn't really made that connection when I was at Hampshire. The spark for this book actually did happen at Hampshire, because it was at that time when I was in there in undergrad in the early 2000s that the sort of no more prisons movement was really popping off. And so a group called the Prison Moratorium Project came to Hampshire and did a workshop. And that was the first time, you know how like now I feel like you don't even have to like, whenever I go to a presentation about prisons and people run down all the statistics, I'm like, okay, this is like this, we got to move beyond this, because it's not just about disproportionality. But at that time, people weren't really running that rap. So like that blew my mind, right? And so years later, after I graduated, I moved to New York and started organizing with the Prison Moratorium Project. The Prison Moratorium Project was founded by Eddie Ellis, co-founded by Eddie Ellis, who was in Attica. So years after that, when I decided to do my PhD, I decided I wanted to do research on the historical relationship between the Prison Moratorium Project and Attica. And I started interviewing Eddie, and Eddie introduced me to his people. And that's sort of how this developed.
This crazy connection. Now I remember where I saw you from, because I was friends with Dana Kaplan. Eddie was a mentor at Prison Moratorium Project down in the city, like on the Lower East Side. And I can't wait to tell Dana like that, you know. And I love that you're like, you go to one thing and you're like, wait.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yep. No, that's it. I mean, and I told you, I was like, we know the same people, you know. No, that was it. And Eddie essentially was like, you know, when I started doing the research for the dissertation, which is now the book, you know, everything I just ran to you about narrative war, I wasn't able to articulate that then. My framework for how I was approaching the project was very much incarcerated by a criminal justice kind of approach, which I think is doomed to really, I don't think criminal justice has the capacity to answer the questions that I'm trying to engage with in a deep way, because it as a discipline, it already legitimizes the whole function of the prison system. It legitimizes a normalized definition of crime in ways that I didn't want to. So I was interviewing Eddie, and he was basically like, look, man, essentially he said, we've already answered the questions that you're trying to ask. And if you really want to be helpful as a politically engaged academic, what we need is someone like you to try to demonstrate that the work, the intellectual work that we've been doing behind the walls for decades is actually more rigorous than most of the stuff you see published in academic journals or whatever, right? So that's a paraphrase. But in the book, I say that was like, he gave me an assignment, that I was given an intergenerational assignment, which I accepted. And this is my response to it. Obviously, Eddie passed away in 2013. But he and many of the other elders were the primary sources that I was looking to, both in terms of like knowledge to understand what was happening, but also in terms of accountability, in the sense that I'm obviously in the academy, and so the book has to meet certain requirements, but in terms of peer review, the real peer review was like, okay, does Jalil Muntakim think I did a good job with this? Would Eddie think I did a good job with this? And so when I got that level of approval, everything else in terms of when the book came out and how people felt about it, like, that wasn't really a concern for me, because it had already passed the standard that I had set for it.
Yeah, and those early days of 2000, all the way, I would say, to about 2014, those 14 years were incredible years around ending mass incarceration. And some of the work we were doing in New York was also, we called the campaign Drop the Rock, to stop the Rockefeller drug laws that here in New York State began what is called mandatory minimum sentences. And so many of our people got caught up just on weed alone, but it was really instructive for me. Like, that's how I also became an better organizer, because at that time I had joined the Malcolm X grassroots movement. Then we're seeing Prison Moratorium Project. We're working together. It begins to grow. It's about ending mass incarceration, but always also freeing our political prisoners and prisoners of war. And what I always try to tell people is, like, movements get wins. They don't get them in 1 year. So, like, people were working for 40 years to get out political prisoners and prisoners of war. People were working, and what we did in Malcolm X grassroots movement, our Black August concerts, that now people will always tell all of us, yo, I didn't even know that. Like, I lived in Brooklyn, I hadn't really heard of the Black Panther Party, or I didn't even know who Assata Shakur and George Jackson was. So, fam, I encourage you to Google first Black August, which became a tradition coming out of the California prison system. And Black August means that month of August, men, most of the brothers, would fast, talk to each other, do the like one-on-one counseling, the elders and all that. And then some members of the Malcolm X grassroots movement went to Cuba and were with Nahanda Abiodun. She also rests in freedom. And she told them, hip hop is powerful. Y'all need to do something. And for 15 years, we did Black August. And even with doing Black August, I was then really good friends with M1 of Dead Prez, and Fred Hampton Jr. had just gotten out, and we were on the road. But one of the biggest moments I remember, like that connection, which I think is so critical, that you also talk about this in the book, and you talk about the long struggle of Attica, was that Shaka Keen, who is the writer and director of Judas and the Black Messiah, he said, when he grew up in Brooklyn, he's like, I'd never even heard of Fred Hampton. And he was at the concert when Fred was there in Brooklyn. And then more than a decade later, he's like, yo, do you know Fred Hampton? I was like, absolutely. He's like, I'm trying to make a movie. I'm like, a movie about his life? Because a lot of people been trying to do that, but it happened. And, I think culture is so necessary, that art and cultural wars are necessary with us that more are political folks. But when you talk about the long Attica revolt, can you talk about that and what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, most of your viewers and listeners will probably have heard of Attica, the Attica Rebellion. I mean, Attica is obviously a prison in Western New York, but when people say Attica, oftentimes they're talking about the Attica Rebellion. And when they talk about the Attica Rebellion, they're typically talking about a 4-day period between September, between September 9th and September 13th, 1971, during which incarcerated mostly Black and Latinx, but also white and Native American brothers seized control of the prison, held it for 4 days. Usually usually the story of Attica is confined to those 4 days. It's usually confined to Attica prison. And the demands that are articulated are usually confined to reformist demands to improve prison conditions, which of course there were demands to improve prison conditions, and those demands were very important to many of the people behind the walls. But what I do in the book is show that not so much that story is wrong, but just that it's incomplete, that the rebellion that culminated in Attica was really part of this protracted prison movement that took place over, at the very least, 13 months, that it traversed multiple jails and prisons and carceral sites throughout the New York State, but also throughout various states and also internationally. And that, there were several demands that were about improving prison conditions, but also, there were radical, revolutionary, and internationalist demands that the people inside took very seriously, that the state, Rockefeller, Nixon, J. Edgar Hoover, they took the revolutionary dimensions of the rebellion very seriously. And also, international movements across the third world took what was happening in Attica very seriously. So the fact that now, when most people talk about Attica, the fact that they're only talking about what I call the minimum demands, the whole thing about improving prison conditions, they wanted that, but that was the minimum of what they wanted. And the fact that all we remember now is the minimum is a result of this narrative war that I'm talking about, where historically the radical and revolutionary edge, not only of Attica, but of all of our movements, it gets watered down and whittled away over time, and then it gets repackaged and re-delivered to our youth in ways that divest it, sanitize it. You know? So.
And we see that, now with Malcolm, and you're like, really, y'all like Malcolm X now?
It's something that should be it's something that we should expect. It's something that we need to be prepared for in terms of our own movements and our own, the apparatus of political education, the programming, like what you're doing now. We need to expect that our movements and narratives will be co-opted and twisted and distorted and used against us. And we need to have some mechanisms in place to, pass down our knowledge on our own terms. And it's always been the case, but I think the present historical moment illustrates that to us very clearly, the fact of the need for an independent different kinds of independent mechanisms for preserving and transmitting our knowledge.
While you were researching and writing the book, what's something that you wouldn't never thought of, or a conversation that you had that really put it in your mind, and you're like, we got to talk more than what happens when a CO does something to someone incarcerated, but like you said, the revolutionary, folks coming out, staying in, but that repression. Did you visit a facility and were like, oh, I didn't know that? Or was everything new to you that you were finding?
I often say that everything that's in the book is what I've learned, There's very little that's in the book that I would have been able to articulate in the way that I did, prior to writing the book. So it was a profound learning experience that I feel really honored to have been able to sort of take part in over a 10-year period, which is how long it took me to write the book. every chapter is really packed with I did a lot of research. I did a lot of archival research. I did a
Yeah.
lot of interviews. I read a lot of books. I read a lot of documents, and I tried my best to, kind of put it all in there as much as I could in a way that was not overwhelming and just kind of tell a story. But like, yo, that book is packed with stories that just totally blew my mind. So there's no one thing that stands out, but I guess the thing that it took me a while to realize, a couple things took me a while to realize. One thing that took me a long time to realize is that war is not a metaphor. I think, because of our exposure to media, we're accustomed to thinking about war in a particular kind of way. Like, we have an image of what war looks like.
Right.
And so when you don't see a whole lot of gunfire, when you don't see there's tons of bloodshed in prison, but when you don't see, the kind of bloodshed that we're all being bombarded with now in terms of Gaza, when you don't see that level, right? That's just how much we've been bombarded with violence, right? You tend to just think that that's something other than war. But like Mao, Huey, so many others, Asada, talked about how politics and war is on a continuum, right?
Right.
And there's different kinds of war unfolding. But once I realized, right, that it wasn't only the kind of like Black radical protagonists of the struggle who were thinking about war, but the state was also thinking about the prison as a site of war. And in fact, they were the ones who thought about it as war first, right? Because they're waging a war on colonized people in the United States. And the prison is one iteration of that protracted war. So once I really internalized that and understood that, that was one of those aha moments. And then the other one is I start the book with a speech that was delivered by Queen Mother Moore. And everything she says in that speech, like the whole book, is encapsulated in the parts of the speech that I include there. It was brilliant how she was able to do that. And one of the things...
Queen Mother Moore, an incredible organizer, an incredible voice, and really started the conversation about reparations and the decades that she worked for. Even when she was like at the last part of her life, she's like, reparations. So I encourage everybody to really know who she is, because sometimes, in a lot of our spaces, Black women have been erased.
100%.
Yes, go ahead.
No, I mean, she politicized Malcolm. She helped move Malcolm to the left. She politicized Muhammad Ahmad, a legendary revolutionary. She politicized Mutulu Shakur. I'm honored to say that she politicized my parents, right? So this is one of the connections, I was talking about in terms of my family. But anyway, one of the things she says, the gist of what she says at the beginning of the book is that, they're trying to turn us, you all are Africans, you're in prison twice because we're already a captive nation. So you're captured twice. So don't think that the goal is just to get out of prison and to get into this world. You actually have to free yourself 2 times, right? And she said, and the other thing she said was that, she says the white man has developed a science of white supremacy, essentially. She's talking about lynching, she's talking about imprisonment, she's talking about sexual violence. And she's saying that the ultimate target of this science of white supremacy is to subjugate you mentally, to preserve your, like, it's not the kind of genocide that'll just destroy your bodies. They actually want to keep your body intact and destroy your mind. And that is really what, by the end of the book, it's demonstrated. I think I demonstrate that is how the prison is functioning, right? As a instrument of war. So that shocked me too,
Yeah, I love in the book that you're centering those folks. It's not like a book filled with like public policy. I mean, a couple of things, but the narrative coming from the people that are most impacted by that. So I want to talk about your new article or paper that came out, The Hidden War Fueling New York's Prison Guard Strike. And as you say, the deadly labor action can be best understood in the context of white supremacy and class struggle. Because even now, what we're seeing is, as we are dealing with this, I would say he's evil, like an evil genius. I'm like, he ain't stupid, but he's it's just like every day you don't even know how to handle all that's coming. And I do feel that once again, class struggle being pushed away. And there's so much, the left has fallen apart. Many movements don't exist. Major distrust in Black brown movements post-Ferguson, but still it is people that are going to be most impacted, even his supporters. And I think when I was reading this, it reminded me about what Fred Hampton, Chairman Fred, bringing the Rainbow Coalition together. And pretty much why he became dangerous was because he was talking about class struggle and imperialism. I mean, there's no other reason that you can't even, people are like, no, that he did something else. Like, no, he was 23 and they were like, we have to get rid of this guy. It's the same with Martin Luther and so many, particularly Black men that were assassinated. They become dangerous when they talk about class struggle and, as you noted, also internationalist struggle. So can you talk about that? What you're saying, the deadly labor action can be understood in the context of white supremacy and class struggle.
Yeah, I mean, so the white supremacy aspect is obviously the one that gets most emphasized in left spaces, and for good reason. I mean, it's there, it's everywhere, it's unavoidable, right? And I should also say, although I don't, you can't draw a line between race and class. They're like two sides to the same coin, and in different contexts, one of them might be primary and the other one might be secondary, and then in another moment it might flip. It's dynamic, but oftentimes, and so theoretically, W.E.B. Du Bois and his work Black Reconstruction, like especially the first 4 chapters of that book, where he talks about the Black worker, the white worker, the planter, and the class contradictions that racism mystifies. That was really an inspiration. That's been a deep inspiration for how I think about class struggle. So let me say it this way. After Attica, that's when the prison building boom in New York and other states begins, right? So in the wake of Attica, right? So in the mid-70s, they start building all these prisons in upstate New York, and this starts to really intensify in the 80s, but it really starts in the 70s, right after Attica. And part of why it starts is because they are trying to build more prisons so that they can have more places to distribute the revolutionaries. They figured out that they were putting too many in one place. They wanted to spread them out, but in order to do that, you needed more capacity. So that's the first important point. That one of the drivers of what people call mass incarceration is counter-rebellion. It's counter-insurgency, right? It's not just about criminalizing poor people, which of course it is about that too, but it's also about crushing a political movement. But the other side of prison growth, and I found evidence of this in the documents right after Attica, Russell G. Oswald, who was the commissioner of the New York prison system at the time of Attica, writes in his proposals, because as you just mentioned, when the state went in to crush the Attica Rebellion, they killed 10 of the guards. They killed 10 white guards. And we're trying to cover it up and lie about it. So obviously the guards were mad about this. They were pissed for good reason. So Oswald says, we're going to build all these prisons, and we're going to build them in rural areas, and it's going to add job security to where you live, right? So what you mentioned in the beginning of the show in terms of like farms and prisons is right, and it was part of an intentional strategy to discourage rural semi-skilled white laborers in upstate New York, to discourage them from thinking about themselves in any kind of alignment with the mostly Black and Latinx people from the city of from the boroughs of New York, from specific neighborhoods of New York, who primarily fill up the cages. So when we talk about race, white supremacy, typically people are talking about, okay, the process that produces disproportionate amount of Black and Latinx, of course, those two things are not mutually exclusive, people in cages. I'm saying that's true, but what's also true is that prisons are also controlling the people who guard the cages. Because part of what the guard strike shows, the guards are talking about how bad their working conditions are.
Right.
Taking all value judgment out of it in politics, like their working conditions are objectively bad. Why is that? Because those prisons are terrible places. What's also true is that the living conditions of the people who are in the cages are bad, and that could be, in a different world, a point of a potential for solidarity, in the sense that,
right.
Well, that must mean that the ruling class doesn't actually care about any of us, right? But because of the racial, because of their financial investment and white supremacy, the guards are unable to see that. Whereas many of the people who are in the cages actually have a very sophisticated analysis of what I just said. They know that. So they see it, they see the structure in a ways that the guards can't see it, because they're disincentivized from seeing it. So that's the dynamic that I was interested in this piece.
Yeah, no, and I mean, yeah, that is a great analysis, because they're not only disappearing incarcerated folks, but like you said, they pick these rural areas. And part of that is also many families, like you said, there has been many studies that show, particularly in New York City, how many Black and Latino men are incarcerated from certain even neighborhoods. But it makes it almost impossible for family to visit. You can get to Sing Sing in New York City, but the rest of them, you're talking about all the way from Coxsackie to the Canadian border, and that is it's a disappearing thing as well.
100%.
Yeah. And they were making very sure that our political prisoners were never in the same prison, right? And I remember after 9/11, when they took Jalil and Matulu and some I think Herman Bell, Herman Bell, yeah. Even up to David Gilbert and David Gilbert's he helped free Assata Shakur. He's a white man. He has come out too. They not only took them out of kept them apart, that they also put him in solitary for like 30 days. But also, this happened with the Puerto Rican political prisoners. When they were granted clemency, one of the conditions were they could never be in the same room with each other. So, people will say, why don't you get them all together? And it's like, well, because it's a conditional pardon or clemency or parole. And one of the conditions is they can't be in the same room. And it really, and also how many times, in all correctional facilities, certain magazines and books have been banned, but the Source magazine, which back in the day was the source of hip hop, doing so many incredible articles, that magazine couldn't even go into the prison. But I love how you say that's a counterinsurgency. It's a rebellion. It is rebellion. wondering about women. Have you done research? Have you been in a women's incarcerated? Yeah. What about women? And
Yeah,
I think
I
part of it too is I try to remember that women who are incarcerated, they don't get visitors the way men are. And like women are, and I think
sure.
part of that is really just a growth kind of like it's all women. How bad could they be? Not bad in that way, but it's women, they're fine. And it's like, no, I mean, the level of sexual assaults are crazy high. And I still think to this day, not enough is being talked about women who are incarcerated.
Yeah, I mean, even if you, I mean, it's clear even when you visit people in a men's prison in the visiting room, it's
Yeah.
all women. And
Yep.
if there are men, they're usually with women. I mean, the children are with the women, so the women are clearly doing um, the vast majority of the kind of like reproductive labor, the support work, and this is also, of course, political work, right? Because they're the ones bringing reading material in, passing messages, giving the updates, doing the analysis. Like there's a lot of political work. And then also networking with each other, building political prisoner support movements. I mean, you think about people like Yuri Kochiyama, people like Safia Bukhari, people like
Yeah.
Laura Whitehorn, people who are holding up, who have held up over the long term, the movement to support political prisoners. You know, it's women. So in terms of my stuff, the book is really a book about men. And initially, so there's a couple reasons for that. Some of them are methodological. In the first instance, it's a methodological problem, right? So prisons are sex segregated. And part of what I was doing is sort of like building these networks, right? And so it became very clear to me that if I wanted to include what was happening in women's prison, and do it at the level of rigor that I was doing with the men's prisons, that the book would take twice as long. So I decided not to do that. And initially I was like, damn, man, this isn't gonna be sufficient. And in some ways it's not, it's incomplete. We need to know more. Like I would love to see this method applied to what was happening in women's prisons. But on the other hand, what it did allow me to do, and which doesn't get done enough, is to really bring a gender analysis to what's happening in men's prisons. Because the problem that I see a lot is that people think that, like, when you say gender theory, that means that you're only talking about women, or that you're only talking about people who are queer, as if, you know, straight men or men who are in, or people who are in prisons for men, right? Because there's all kinds of different genders in men's prisons, but whatever, that they don't have gender or whatever. And
Right.
so, you know, there's a gender analysis throughout the text. I talk about, you know, the kind of Black radical masculinities that were being developed behind the walls. And I talk about the intensity of how sex and sexuality was weaponized by the state, which is also something that doesn't get talked about as much. I mean, typically, when you hear people talking about sexual violence in prisons, it's usually like, I just recently saw this disgusting skit on the 50th anniversary of Saturday Night Live, featuring, I think it was Eddie Murphy and Will Ferrell, and they were just doing what everyone who's watching this will be familiar with, which is telling a whole bunch of prison rape jokes.
Yeah.
Which is, it's totally socially acceptable to do that when you're talking about men. And so what does that say about what's actually happening? So, but typically when people talk about it, it's like, it's usually a Black male prisoner committing sexual assault against a younger white incarcerated person, right? And of course, all these things do happen, but people don't tend to be aware of the research that shows that at least half of all the sexual assaults that occur in prisons are performed by guards, right?
Yeah.
And it's not always male guards. Sometimes it's female guards, right?
Yeah.
So sexual violence is and then connecting that to the kind of strip frisks that are a normal part of incarcerated life, and which people are increasingly coming to understand that that is a form of institutionalized sexual assault. So anyways, so really bringing the gender analysis to this is something that was important to me. And,
Yeah.
and then the last thing I'll say, I mean, I mentioned it, but just to emphasize it, there's important women all throughout the book. So I started with Queen Mother Moore and mentioned her throughout. Safia Bukhari's in there. Unfortunately, one of my regrets is that like Yuri's mentioned in the footnotes, but like and I mentioned her in the acknowledgments, but like Yuri's not really a figure in the book. But like, so that's and then there are a lot of other women who show up in the book in critical ways.
Yeah, and Yuri Kochiyama was a badass Japanese woman that faced internment with her family and would then become Malcolm's one of his closest comrades, and she was there when he was murdered. And I mean,
she was a member of the RNA.
The Republic of Africa.
She held up. She was the central locus of supporting revolutionary political prisoners in the late 60s and early 70s.
Absolutely.
And again, she was incredible.
RNN is the Republic of New Africa, and the Malcolm X grassroots movement is burst through there, becomes an organization through Chokwe Lumumba, may he rest in peace, or as we say, rest in freedom. And you say in the article, this normalized race war is also a gender war, as racial violence is often enacted in intensely sexualized ways. But I do want to talk about these two brothers, right, that were beaten to death. We got Robert Brooks, and folks, if you've been following, I've the lawyer on both times. The first time in New York State history, probably maybe the rest of the country, maybe not California, but what we do know that 10 officers have been indicted of murder, which honestly, when white DA was up there, I was like, ain't anything gonna happen. He said murder. I was like, oh, this is about to change the game. And then seeing his son and always like, then knowing it's like near Rochester and the way police behave in Albany, all the way to the Canadian border. Like, people sometimes don't understand the level of repression of Black and Latino folks in these areas, because we're not considered a big city, or someone is killed, it's not a big deal. So then we see Robert Brooks beaten to death. And then less than 6 weeks later, this brother, Messiah, I think his last name is Umia. And I was actually reading part of this because when they went, what happened to Robert Brooks happened in the infirmary part. And you see all these people with their cameras on, like whatever, and even nurses laughing. I feel like the nurses should have been indicted. One
of them got fired.
Right. I thought, yeah, but even with that, I was like, you should never be a nurse. Like, I wouldn't want you around anybody. But when the investigators went in to see what happened to this young brother, Messiah, who was 22, what happened was they beat him in the pod. So those that were in their cell were hearing him being beaten. And this one brother who's not afraid to go on the record. His name is Gerard Crosby, 46. He said he could see from his cell window officers and medical workers giving the prisoner CPR inside. He also said that in the housing area, the inmates were then told to clean up the blood, that a bloody mop and the prisoner's belongings were removed. And then another brother says, all I could hear him say, please stop. Please stop, Mr. Perry. You're really hurting me. Please stop. Why do in all your research, and I know this is more like a psychological question, the first guards, they knew their cameras were on. How do you do that? I'm not saying we haven't seen that. What I'm saying to me is that footage was clearer than any other footage I've ever seen. A police officer, anybody, like, the film's not grainy. You're seeing people laughing. Like, did they actually think they were going to get away with this?
Well, so they didn't think their cameras were on. That's the first thing. That's not true. So they did not turn their cameras on. There was a lot of public pressure. So I'd be interested to understand why, but what actually happened was they had a kind of camera called the Axios 3. And like all these other speed cameras out here, I'm in DC, there's speed cameras everywhere. Yeah. Them joints is always recording. It's always recording. It's just if you set it off, it'll trigger something and then you'll get a thing in the mail, but they're always recording. So at any point, until they erase it, they can go back and recall that footage. It's the same with the body cams that they had on. They didn't know that though. That's the story that I've heard. And it's linked in one of the links in my piece. So they did not record it, but there was so much public pressure. And it was clear that this man had been beaten to death that someone, I don't know if it was Letitia James or whoever, got they called it video recall footage from the manufacturer, from the company that they, get the cameras from. And that's how they got the footage. So, so there's that. But the other thing is that some of those people who were involved have pending cases against them. So they, so it's been revealed that they were part of the Marcy beat up squad. So this is kind of what they do, right? So the way that, prisons are institutionalized forms of violence, and so they operate through violence. It's a coercive institution. And so most prisons, most prisons, right? But all prison systems have within them a uniquely and specifically sadistic contingent of people who again, and I'm not I don't want to be in these people's minds, but it seems from the outside like they enjoy doing this kind of violence, right? And those kinds of people are really useful. It can't be admitted. Docs will never admit it, but they need people like that in order to keep the whole system in check. And so you got these beat up squads in all these prisons where this kind of stuff is happening. There's a statistic that I cite in that piece that a person dies every 3 days in a New York State prison, right? All of them are not beaten to death, right? But we don't. But if that video had never been released, and if it wasn't so gruesome, we wouldn't have known we wouldn't even know Robert Brooks's name. He would have just been another of the people who die every 3 days. So, these places thrive on secrecy, right? So the more we are asking questions, connecting with the people inside, writing about it, shedding light on it. I got a homeboy who's inside now in the New York prison system, and he always says, they like roaches, man. When you turn the light on, they run. When you turn the lights on, they run.
Every 3 days. Yeah.
So,
we know psychologically, we know like they just don't see people's humanity, but I'm always like, no, they see it. They just don't want to do the right thing. And we shouldn't, like, sometimes it can become more the story of the CEO as not a story of not only the person that's been beaten, but what you just highlighted was some people call them goon squads. Like, you don't want to get CO A B C D E up in here, do you? And most of them will be like, oh hell no, because if these dudes come in, it's going to be bad. And they have like this negotiating CO all the time. And that, that Stockholm syndrome kind of thing where some part of it is also people are trying to survive. If a prisoner is dying every 3 days in New York State, that also gets around to the other people. They're going to know real quickly. And and be like, yo, just we can't do, or we can't demand, equal treatment. So before I let you go, I just want to, oh my God, whoa. This is the most people I've ever had on commenting. Wow. Okay, so everybody's like, I didn't know that. I need to get the book. Um, People who are worked in formerly worked or taught and incarcerated. Fam, I'm gonna keep all these. I get to keep them, so I'm gonna just send them to Dr. Burton because this is really good. Oh
Right
wow.
on. Appreciate
So
y'all.
everybody, people are saying the narrative war, the language, nomenclature reform equals more pleasant word for state re-education. All right, fam, you're coming through tonight. So before we wrap up, you are you're doing work and have spoken about seeing Gaza and what you write about as connective tissues, and what can we learn from what is happening in Gaza that is connected to what is happening in the United States, and how, not only are people disappeared, just this constant of surveillance, and always like you have to be ready to be under attack at some level.
Yeah, you know, it's a hard question to know how to answer because there's so many different ways that one could do. I mean, one thing that I think about, so my book came out like right as October, like it came out on October 31st, but it was like, it started to come out before that. So it basically came out right when October 7th happened. And a lot of people commented on the similarity, right? So this idea that it's a prison break, right? Which of course, even like Bit Salam, Israeli human rights organization, an Israeli human rights organization, have been calling Gaza an open air prison well before October 7th. So like this idea that Gaza is a prison isn't at all controversial, or shouldn't be, right? But also that before this genocide started, there were roughly 2.3 million people in Gaza, which is, almost pretty much on par with the total US prison population. We could go in terms of how it all unfolded, from like the lying about, like this idea of the Hannibal doctrine, not, not being honest about like the percentage of the hostages killed by the state versus, militants, the use of sexual atrocity propaganda to try to turn people against the movement, right? Yeah. So all of this rape misinformation that is being spread through the New York Times. The New York Times also spread rape misinformation about Attica when they said that the Attica rebels cut the guards' throats, castrated one of the hostages, and put the guard's penis in his own mouth. That's what the New York Times said happened. Of course, that did not happen. That was a lie. Right. And the New York Times never printed a retraction about that, right? So there are all of these parallels. So it's like, when Attica happened, people were saying that it was and it is, I mean, it's like one of the bloodiest single day encounters on US soil. People were saying since the Civil War. That's not true. It's since the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, right? 39 people were killed during the Attica massacre. So what's happening in Gaza is like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Atticas happening every day. You know what I mean? Like the scale is incalculable. But then I think about, just the intensity of the solidarity, right? So like, there was that brother who was about to get out of prison in California, who donated his wages, his wages for prison labor. He donated them. It was like $30, but it took him like several weeks to accumulate that much money, and he donated it to relief efforts in Gaza. And I think this speaks to a really long history, not only of Black Palestinian solidarity, but solidarity between the Black and Palestinian prison movements, right? And so there, a lot of the work that's coming out is starting to be translated by the Palestinian political prisoners movement into English. See, and that's what slowed us down, is that a lot of the stuff is out there, but it's in Arabic. So Wizam Rafidi has a book. I hope I pronounce his name right. It's called The Trinity of Fundamentals. That's a book about the Palestinian underground and the Palestinian prison. It was smuggled out by a Palestinian political prisoner. And then Walid Daka, who was a long time political prisoner in Palestine, who passed away recently, but who wrote a lot of stuff, and some of it's translated into English, and it's very much about the psychological aspect, the psychological warfare aspect of incarceration, and it maps very it maps nicely is not the right word. It maps onto what the people on our side of the world have been saying about how prisons are functioning as counterinsurgency. So there's lots of overlaps. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just so, first of all, thank you so much for coming in on short notice. I mean, when I saw you on Democracy Now, something clicked in me. It must have been like, obviously, and then you're like, I know you from the end. Like, so what would you suggest to maybe someone that's watching that's a little younger for them to begin to understand that it's not, obviously being incarcerated is repression, but there's still, as you talked about, a counterinsurgency in and out behind the walls and in the prisons. Like, what would you say to them if they wanted to start knowing more information and like become active around these issues of mass incarceration? Because I think we're at a time right now that I think people think that we've won the whole ideal like work around mass incarceration. What's really happened is reform, which I'm always like, yeah, you can't reform a prison, but I get it. We want to reduce the harm. So how would you, what is if someone younger just was like, I didn't even know this? Like, where would you have them? Of course, your book and all the work you do, but their journey into doing work around not only mass incarceration, but violence in all these spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't even think I would probably recommend my book. I mean, I'm thinking of my own child. I have 3 children. I'm thinking of my 13-year-old who has shown no interest in reading the book at this moment, and I'm not encouraging him to at this moment. It'll be there for him when he's ready. One of the things that I like to emphasize with young people is that some people can hear all the stuff because there's mind control in my book and the CIA and there's all kind of stuff, right? Some people can hear that, and it could be very easy to like fall into defeatism and be like, oh man, well, whatever, we can't win, whatever. And I get that, but there's another way to look at it. And actually, I was thinking about it when you talked about the members of the Puerto Rican movement who couldn't be in the same room together. It's like, yo, what does that say about how powerful we are? What does that say about how the state sees us in terms of our revolutionary capacity? Like, we're that dope.
Yeah,
they have to organize this massive apparatus to make sure that we don't even talk to each other. Yeah. That tells us how important it is that we talk to each other, that we be together, that we create spaces together. So emphasizing that, and then I remember like one of the first books I read from cover to cover was Assata Shakur's autobiography. Like, and I just happened.
Yep.
I just happened to live in a household where that was on the bookshelf, and I don't know what happened. Like, I was in high school. I didn't really like to read like that. I didn't like to read, but I don't know what happened. But I just picked it off the shelf and I opened it up, and it was just like a light bulb went off. You know what I mean? So I don't know if it will still have that, what has that effect with these generations, but I've always taken to biographies, but it's figuring out how to embark on a process that you can stick with for the long term. And I think everybody's path to it is different. Everyone's not going to take to the questions of repression, but there's all kinds of different ways that people can plug into movements. Like, some people like to garden, and like, yo, we need people growing food out here. You know what I'm saying? So it's figuring out how to do what you're good at and what you want to do in service of broader movements, and figuring out how to build a structure of accountability so that you can plug in the way that makes the most sense for your life.
Yeah, anytime I say a saga, I'm like, first it reads like a thriller, and
Right.
then you're like, she's on the ground, and then she's here, and wait, put her in man's jail like that. Like she was put in a man's prison, like underground, and then of course the great escape, and what it's for all those comrades. What I always find, like, when I'm hopeless, I'll always like read one of the political prisoners. I'm like, you know, read
Mm-hmm.
you can say it's hopeless, but look at what they were doing without a social media, underground revolutionary activities. But every time they come out, like Laura Whitehorn or Jalil, some of the ones I'm closer to, like when Joe Muncie King came out, I was like, Baba, you're not angry? He's like, girl, I spent 50 years organizing. I'm spending the rest of my life organizing here. Or Oscar Lopez Rivera, do you want to just lay on a for the rest of your life because you deserve that? Yeah,
Yeah,
we don't
you
have time for
deserve
that.
it. Like you could do that if you wanted to, and
Right?
you would have a
And
right
they
to do
don't.
that. Mm-hmm.
And I never
Mm-hmm.
thought it that way. How they don't even want them in the same room together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm gonna have to bring you back. Thank you for spending this time with us. It's my most watched show, and when I heard you on Democracy Now, it's like those connections. Even to Palestine, it reminds me when the Ferguson uprising began, and within a day there were Palestinians straight up telling Ferguson people like, "Oh, that's the same tear gas that they use on us. We're with
Mm-hmm.
Ferguson." And I think that moment became a moment where the younger generation of Black activists and Palestinians were tight, because we all should know that that's what they try to do. They always want to try to separate particularly Black folks in this country from Palestinian people, and separate those movements. And as always, young people and with social media show it's like that internationalist perspective is there, or that we are like citizens of the world. When one of us is being attacked, we're all being attacked. So Dr. Orisanmi Burton, I want you back. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and I'll be in touch, and
Right
set
on.
that I can share with people. And again, I'm really grateful and thank you for your time.
Likewise, this was a great conversation. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Great. Appreciate you, bro.
Peace.
Peace. Okay, everybody. So sorry on Instagram. Unfortunately, they always cut me down. I want to tell you, thank you, everybody who made comments. I so appreciate this. I've learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot today. And one thing that I just realized is like, we got to have our narrative and think of us as the counter insurgency in the work that we're doing, whether it's on the streets or writing or supporting organizations. So as I close out the show, I think while we're going through this Trumpism and this craziness in this country that's going to become more and more violent against Black and brown people, know your local organization, your crew, where can you self-determine your own fate, where are you going to eat, like all of those things, as we said, mutual aid, and coming together where we're at, that people don't have to fly to another state. They could do that and join. And so, but it seems to me that now every day, pretty much in every state I've seen, there is a growing resistance and rebellion, not just against this person. Really, this is happening because white supremacy in this country is like in its last grasp for power. And that's why they want to subjugate us, whether they pick us up, throw us in a van, move us to another prison, while they brutalize people who are fighting for human rights. And now we're going to see, particularly, unfortunately, what happens in a capitalist, hyper-capitalist society as this inflation is crumbling. They're going to try to pit particularly working class people of all stripes to get, to fight against each other, as opposed to everything he promised 77 million of his people who are now angry. Trumpism will tell them, well, the reason you're angry is because of these DEI hires or these DEI Congress people who won't sign a budget. And we have to fight and counter that narrative as well. So thank you, everybody. We will see you next week. Follow Cooperation Jackson, follow Disrupt the Chaos, follow me on social media. I appreciate y'all, and have a good night, and I'll see you next week. Peace, everybody.